for Shapps to go so far as to call out the Russians and China and talk about an unstable and irrational world. I mean, we spoke to a couple of people last week, Tobias Elwood, who intimated this is a Cold War, this is like 1939. Now, of course, people will say, are you warmongering? The world's at an interesting position, isn't it?
I mean, I don't think that will come to a shock as anyone. We've got the conflict. Russia's invaded Ukraine, the first and largest war in Europe. Well, certainly the largest war in Europe since the end of World War II. We've seen what's going on in Israel, Gaza, with Israel and Gaza. And then, just last week now, the UK and the US launching airstrikes into Yemen. And that's not to mention the other conflicts, or the other potential flashpoints, I should say, with China over Taiwan. Clearly tension brewing there, especially with the recent election. And Grant Shapps mentioned North Korea, often one of the countries that's, one of the malign actors, as London and Washington often refer to it, but involved already. So North Korea, the prospect of perhaps the UK going to war with North Korea might seem very, very distant. But we know that North Korea is already supplying shells, ammunition shells, to Russia. And indeed, Russia has fired North Korean ballistic missiles into Ukraine. So all of these countries' potential conflicts interrelated, and the concern being that either discrete wars and conflicts erupt in each area, in each theatre was the word that Grant Shapps used, or somehow they are more closely interrelated, and then we're looking at the really terrifying prospect of a world war.
Yeah, you've used the term distant there, particularly talking to North Korea. What was interesting is Grant Shapps laid out a time frame, and he said, what could happen within the next 5 years? What message do you think he was trying to convey? And crucially, who was he trying to convey it to?
It's a really good question. I think the main message was one of urgency. And Grant Shapps said in the Q&A that came after the speech that actually one of the main objectives of that speech was to try and rally the UK's allies, particularly NATO allies, to follow what he said was Britain's lead in increasing defence spending. Now, Britain is near the top of the table in NATO for defence spending. We're by no means at the top. In fact, we can certainly look at countries like Poland and the way they've responded in the wake of the Ukraine crisis, really ramping up their focus on defence, ramping up their focus on buying in the sorts of hardware.
I was going to ask this, and without being cynical, I think Wallace went patently because I think he wanted more money. Yes, it's an election year, but with what's happening in the world, I think questions are being asked. There was that figure the other day, we once had 25 frigates, we've now got 6 or 7. Certainly with everything that's going on, is this not as much as a call to our partners, not even a pre-election thing, but is this not finally the government understanding that we have cut back so massively in all defence spending that we need to change that? Is it to talk subtly to the public, perhaps, who might be cynical of spending more money when there's such a cost of living crisis going? I don't know.
Jeremy, I think it might well be that. I think it might also be a message to the government, to the Prime Minister. We're in an interesting situation where we've got a Defence Secretary who was on record during his brief campaign to be the Conservative leader, where he said he thought defence spending should be 3% of GDP. We've got a Chancellor who said exactly the same thing. He said 3%, and he promised to reverse the cuts to the army when he was running to be Conservative leader.
Good point.
Rishi Sunak, on the other hand, is known within defence circles to be reluctant to give defence more money. And certainly during the last round of when the MOD was looking for a better settlement, they were talking to Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson was the one who ultimately was signing off the money, perhaps against Rishi Sunak's judgment or preference.
Really interesting.
But the wider picture of this, we're going to look a little bit at what's happening in the US on the programme, and of course the election there as well. If Donald Trump is elected, how might that sort of change the power structure in NATO? Because previously Donald Trump was totally supportive of NATO and therefore support of Ukraine. If Donald Trump is elected, might that change things, which makes Grant Shapps' call for everybody on the global stage, particularly in the West, to sort of step up? Does that sort of add new weight to that?
100%. I mean, if Donald Trump is elected, what comes with Donald Trump is uncertainty. And I think many people within the sort of, military, geopolitical security community would argue that, uncertainty plays in the immediate terms into the hands of our enemies. But Donald Trump was very clear that he thought NATO allies Europe needed to pay more for Europe's defence. And that message did get through, and that message worried a lot of NATO nations who haven't been.
He could be described as right, though, couldn't he? And if you take your first point, it could be what Shapps is trying to implicate. One of the things that I thought, certainly, is how ineffective NATO's been in the last few years, and maybe it needs to look at itself. But it is interesting that the Tory party, with everything that's going on, Jerome, seem to be focusing on this. And I like your point, I didn't know that Shapps and both Hunt, when running for the leader, were asking for more money. So another headache for Sunak.